Hello, gasaholics. I'm Hot Rod Bob, and you've got Gas, the great American auto scene. Since 1990, your source for automotive information, news and views, and a little humor thrown in from time to time. This year is the 70th anniversary of the Corvette, America's sports car, I'm told, from Chevrolet. It is the only American sports car that has prevailed over decades of production. Now, the Corvette was introduced in 1953, and it had good and bad reviews. Styling? That was good. Power plant? People said it wasn't enough, yet it had as much horsepower as a Jaguar of the day. Okay, it's an overhead valve six-cylinder instead of a double overhead cam like the Jag. It had multiple side draft carburetors like the Jag, but not the SUs like the Jag. It didn't have a proper transmission, and that is one of the downfalls of the original Corvette. It had a two-speed power glide. That was the only available transmission back then. Why? I don't know. And GM doesn't really say why the power glide automatic was the only transmission available. It didn't have door handles like traditional cars of the day, but then again, there were sports cars that didn't. It didn't have roll-up windows, but then again, neither did the Jaguar Roadster, my Triumph, or even my MG of the day. They had side curtains. Okay, that's not a big deal. That's fitting with British sports cars, so they got part of the cue right. It had a fiberglass body, very unique for the time. Now, Kaiser Darren was fiberglass as well, and there were a number of kit cars coming out at that time that were also fiberglass, and they fit on various chassis from Fords to who knows what, powered by everything from Fords to who knows what. But the only full production vehicle was the Corvette. Now, 1953 Corvette, or Chevrolet, made 300 Corvettes. They only sold 135 or 40, somewhere in that neighborhood, which was dismal, and it nearly killed the idea of a Corvette. Now, the first Corvettes, called the C1, were produced in Flint, Michigan for 1953. By the end of 1953, they moved the production to a real assembly line, kind of, in St. Louis. So it was there for quite some time. We'll go into that in just a little bit. But I want to go into the history of the Corvette and tell you a little bit about it. Now, when the car was first introduced at the Waldorf Astoria in New York at the New York Auto Show, there were three body types shown. There was the Nomad. Yes, the Nomad. And it was a two-door station wagon based on the Corvette design. Roll-up windows, station wagon style, two-door. Kind of cool looking. Didn't go into production. There was a fastback. That was really nice looking. It didn't go into production. It was called the Corvair. Names so far sounding familiar? Well, GM liked the name, so they applied them to different vehicles later on. The car that was chosen for production was a two-seat Roadster, side curtains, no door handles like we're used to. You couldn't lock the vehicle. It had an inline six-cylinder. Now, the base Chevy six-cylinder at the time was about 115 horsepower. The Corvette, with its modified six-cylinder, side draft carburetors, was 150 horsepower. And as I said, that matched the XK120 Jaguar of the day. It was more horsepower than the Austin Healey of the day. But for some reason, the American public said, yeah, it's not enough horsepower to be a sports car. Well, really, guys, it was enough horsepower. The biggest problem was you put it behind or in front of a Power Glide two-speed automatic that really zapped the horsepower, didn't give you the acceleration, and didn't give you the control you needed for it to be a real sports car. And even at that, Chevrolet didn't have a four-speed ready to go behind that engine. All they had was three-speed manual transmissions, and they elected not to put that behind that 150 horsepower because they didn't think it would last very long. It's a possibility, but it sure would have made that car fun to drive. And again, no four speeds available, so it would have been a three-speed. Now, the beginnings, like I said, hand-built sports car in Flint, Michigan. That didn't last long. The fiberglass body was cool. The six-cylinder engine was reliable. but it just wasn't what things needed. And as I said, the first year, 300 Corvettes were produced in 1953. Only 183, that's the exact number of Chevrolet is releasing, were sold. And that nearly killed it. Now, most people blame well, they said it wasn't a Grand Tourer because it didn't have enough horsepower. And, well, it didn't appeal to the sports car crowd because all it had was an automatic transmission. Now, you could get it any color you wanted as long as it was polo white with a red interior. That's it. That was the old Henry Ford deal with the T bucket. You get where the Model T, you can get it in black, and the optional colors were black. Same thing. But by 1954, General Motors saw some of the error of their ways, and they offered different colors. Mechanically, the car didn't change. It was still that six-cylinder, 150 horsepower. But now you had red, black, and blue colors to choose from. And it had a revised camshaft, added 5 more horsepower. Okay, that's good. It's more horsepower. Well, they decided they wanted to produce 10,000 Corvettes per year by then. It wasn't going to happen. For 1954, they sold 3,640, far short of projections. So now the Corvette is a loser. It's not hitting projections, and those are what manufacturing costs were based on. So 1954, kind of a sluggish year. But in 1955, Chevrolet finally enters the performance era and introduces the 265 cubic inch V8. It naturally found its way into the Corvette in 1955 when it was introduced also in the full-size Chevrolets of the day. And you got to remember, for those of you who are not old enough to remember, there weren't multiple body types back then or styles. You had one body type. It had different trim levels, and that was what designated the models. In the case of the full-size Chevys, the 150, 210, and Bel Air models in 1955. What's the difference? The amount of stainless steel and chrome trim and interior trims. That's the difference. There was no mid-size car. There was no compact car back then. The Corvette had to base itself on some of the components from the Chevrolets of the day. And that was another downfall for the Corvette. The front suspension came right out of a Chevrolet sedan. The rear suspension was different because, well, it was a shorter wheelbase, but they shortened the basic frame that was used on the full-size cars. Was the Corvette an excellent handling car? A good handling car? No, not really. It was an adequate handling car, a little bit better than the sedans that the components came from, but still not a true sports car. And that wouldn't happen for a long time coming. One of the downfalls of the Corvette was the braking system, drum brakes. The imports had already started going to disc brakes back in those days. Chevrolet depended on drum brakes all the way around. And until the early 1960s, that was the downfall of racing Corvettes, the ability to stop. Somewhat important. What do you think? So 1955, as I said, the 265 came in, and now Chevrolet had a 3-speed manual transmission that could hold the power. So that's what they put in. 3-speed, floor-shifted transmission. Still not a 4-speed. Still not equal to the British cars it was trying to compete against. But it was there. 1956 and 57, now the horsepower war started going on. And Corvette got a little bit more refined, different body style. They changed everything. There was nothing carried over other than some appearance pieces, but that's about it. They really changed the 1955 or 56 through 57 Corvettes. And that was also the introduction of fuel injection. Yes, 1957. Mechanical fuel injection on the Corvette. That bumped the horsepower up. Now, the V8 carries over, but a new camshaft design, 210 horsepower in the base model. A second carb could be available. Now you had dual carburetors, and you had 225 horsepower. Very good for the time. However, in 1955, Ford introduces the 2-seat Thunderbird. Now, Ford says it's not a sports car. It's a boulevard cruiser. It's a personal luxury type vehicle. But it was quicker. And it had the 292 or 272, then 292 and 312 V8s, the Y block of the time, when Ford stopped producing the flathead, and it produced some good horsepower. The Thunderbird was a success right out of the box, still not hitting the numbers that Ford had anticipated, and definitely not hitting the sports car market that they wanted to, but it did get the boulevard cruisers and the luxury buyers at the time. Corvette never went after the luxury buyers back in those days. They were looking for the sport car crowd, and they kind of got them, but they missed the mark. So 1955, with the new body style, they introduced roll-up windows. That made a big difference. So you had a little wind wing, you had a roll-up window, you can even get a factory hardtop. That's now making the car a little bit more civilized, and that would appeal to more people. In 1956, now the legend. Now you got some more horsepower, 0 to 60 in 7.5 seconds. The Chevrolet Corvette enlarges the V8's displacement to 283 cubic inches beginning in 1957. Now we got some horsepower available and the fuel injection. 283 horsepower, 283 cubic inches. It was a rocket ship for the time. Now again, remember, you've got to put this all in perspective for the days that this car was produced. By today's standards, that's nothing. Four cylinders get the horsepower the Corvette fuel-injected V8 got back then. But today, well, four-cylinder, turbocharged, they get that horsepower too. 1958 to 1960, now the car really starts to improve. The federal laws change on headlights. Chevrolet gets quad headlights in 1958. The body gets a little bit more refined, a little bit more accent on styling. Some of it functional, some of it just visual. But, hey, it's still moving on. And the Corvette now produces 290 horsepower from its fuel-injected V8 and then rises to 315 horsepower in 1960. So now we got some horsepower. They still haven't addressed the issue with brakes. Now, they tried with different linings on the brake shoes. Again, disc brakes not available, and that was a shortcoming. I've spoken with a number of people who raced Corvettes back in those days, and the brakes wouldn't last through a normal race. So that was a problem because you had to slow down from time to time, and that wasn't the way to do it. The 61 to 62 Corvettes are last of what they call the C1. Now, C1 Corvettes refer to the solid axle or live axle in the rear Corvettes. The chassis were basically the same. The differentials were the same. The basic suspension was the same front to rear. Nothing really changed other than body style and options. In 1961, you had the coves on the side of the body, still a Corvette marking, I guess you could say. But in 1962, the trim around that cove went away and the separate color. Up until 61, you got a separate color and a piece of stainless or aluminum trim around that cove. That went away in 1962. The car became a little bit plainer, but we got to see what the back end of a 1963 Corvette was going to look like, because 61 and 62 had changed to that dual head taillight situation in the back and the sharper design. Now, until 1962, though, there was still a trunk lid and a trunk. 1963 ushers in the first major changes for the Corvette, the C2 model, independent rear suspension, better engine options, 4-speed manual transmissions. Well, they came in later on, or in the early 60s, but now this is now a powerhouse performance car. The Z06 first introduced the big tank, the tanker cars, the fuel-injected cars. These were now running strong in road racing. Some people would take them out to the drags. They did quite well back then, but the road racing was where Chevrolet wanted that Corvette to be known for, and it was. So much so that there was a guy out here in California. He was an ex-Le Mans champion and wasn't able to race anymore, so he decided to build a car. You might have heard of it. It's called Cobra. Yeah. Well, it started giving Corvettes a run for the money. So in 1963, with the body style changes, they had a Roadster, still no trunk, but a Roadster, and the Fastback with the spine in the middle. I mean, this is a beautiful car. These cars were amazingly. The front suspension still didn't change all that much. Still carried over from the original 1953 suspension. They did some upgrades to it over the years, but nothing significant. Matter of fact, that front end stayed in production through 1982 for the most part. Now, the Corvette, beautiful car. First year of the flip-open headlights. That was amazing for the time. 1963, this was excitement. Independent rear suspension. This is something Duntop wanted for a long time. Finally got through. This improved the handling of the Corvette immeasurably. They still didn't get disc brakes, though. That's right. And the first 1963 Corvettes, there was no disc brakes in the front. It carried over the basic braking combination from the previous years. And still a sore spot for road racers. You ran out of brakes before you ran out of gas. And you were still racing at the time. So that was a problem. But they did end up fixing that. The Stingray, beautiful car. Now the 327 cubic inch V8 engine is really putting out some horsepower. And that, although started in 1962, by 1963 it was refined even more. In 1963, as I said, the Z06 came out. Now this was a definitely geared to road racing performance model. And you had the option of the big tank. It was a huge fuel tank, so you could go the distance without having to make a pit stop. And they added some things like vacuum brake booster, dual master cylinder, power drum disc brakes still, but with sintered metal brake linings, larger shock absorbers, bigger front and rear sway bars. And it was limited, though, to the 360 horsepower V8s. Now, 250 horsepower was standard. That's still better than the other Corvettes of the time. And a 4-speed transmission. The RPO code Z06 was just applied to 199 Corvettes in 1963. If you find one of those Z06 Corvettes, man, they are worth a bunch. By 1965, they had made some major changes to the vehicle. Now, buyers could still opt for drums as a credit of $64, but brake improvements were timely upgrades, and they put a big block in the cars. The optional engine displacement, 6.5 liters, 396 cubic inches, produced 425 horsepower. Made that motor a grenade, but disc brakes were now available. Yeah, that's right. In 1964, I believe, the disc brake was offered for the front. By 1965, you got even better. 1966, even bigger, is still better. It's still the same body type. They've made some refinements to it, but the 396 goes away. It was only a one-year motor. Now you've got 427 cubic inches, 435 horsepower, and now Chevrolet is headed, their target is the Cobras. Shelby sees this, and he puts the 427 in the AC, and, well, the race was on. The 427 was added in 1967, and it's dubbed, there was one dubbed the L88, top of the line, 430 horsepower on paper. The real number was closer to 560 horsepower back then. But, hey, who cares? It was fast. Only 20 of those were actually sold, General Motors says, so if you come across an L88 Corvette, it's a rare beast. But make sure you check out the history, and the National Corvette Restorers Society, NCRS, is probably a good place to start to validate what you've got. 1968 to 71, based on the show vehicle, the Mako Shark, the 1968 Corvette is introduced. Flip-up headlights instead of rolling open headlights. A more stylish design. The back end becomes flat. The car ends up with rounded fenders. A whole different vehicle. Only thing carried over, the chassis from 1963. So, improvements made. The 427 still available. The fuel-injected engine of the Corvette is gone now. Yep, I believe 1966 may have been the last year of that fuel-injected engine. But carbureted engines, less expensive to produce, they were getting the horsepower, and people weren't as put off by a carburetor. They knew how to address those. They knew how to tune them. They knew how to adjust them. The fuel injection was still black magic back in those days, and only a few people really had a handle on them. But after 5 model years, the C2 Corvette replaced it was gone and was replaced by the C3. C3 is what's called the Mako Shark styling. That body style, with modifications though, was long in tooth. It stayed in production from 1968 till 1982. Now they changed the bumpers, they changed the interior a little bit, they changed the engines, and were able to downsize the engines and reduce horsepower over its life, which was a real sticking point to the enthusiasts. As a matter of fact, automatics outsold manual transmissions by that point in time. And in the state of California, for example, you really couldn't get a manual transmission because they didn't certify it for the state. You had to go to Arizona or Nevada to buy the manual transmission. Now, towards the last year of production, they did offer a manual transmission in 1981, but it was only attached to a 305 cubic inch V8 engine. Now, that didn't put out much horsepower, 180. Really. Corvette hadn't seen that low horsepower since the early days of production. But the Mako Shark 68 through 71, they're saying, was pre-bumper. Now, this is steel bumper cars. This is a nice car, good-looking car. They sold a lot of them. You could get up to a 454 cubic inch engine back then. And 390 horsepower was dubbed the LS5. The 1968 to 71 Roadsters were cool. Still, no trunk since 1962. It was smooth back there, and the fuel tank was back there. The LS6 was now available, 425 horsepower. And again, the target, you're going after Cobras. They did. They did well. As a matter of fact, that was the most challenging event, not Ford versus Ferrari as much as Cobra versus Corvette. 1973 ushered in the rubber bumper era, and they had to change things on that. It also ushered in the emissions systems beginning in 1968, and that started reducing horsepower. Now, there was another thing that reduced horsepower, and a lot of people don't realize this or don't accept it, but the manufacturers went from brake horsepower readings to net horsepower readings. Well, the net is with all the accessories on. It's a good 20 to 30% reduction. So was horsepower really dropped that great? No, not really. It was just a different way of rating it. So it did appear to be a lot less. And it was minorly reduced because of lower compression ratios, catalytic converters, and the advent of unleaded gasoline. But most of it was because of the change from brake horsepower to net horsepower, which is still the system we use today. And we've got cars now with net horsepower greater than what brake horsepower was back in those days. My daily driver's got 155 net horsepower, and that's only a lowly four-cylinder that gets me 30 plus miles per gallon. All right, so the 1973 Corvette now down to 190 horsepower, and the big block is rated at 275 horsepower. Again, those are net ratings. Add about 30% to that, and that will give you the brake horsepower. But people didn't look at it that way. So the 5.7-liter V8 falls down to as low as 165 net horsepower, although a 205 horsepower option was available, unless you were in California, I think it was. 75 Corvette was up against the Gullwing Bricklin SV1 at the time. Not really. There weren't that many Bricklins sold, but it was a sports car, kind of. It was fiberglass in most places, but it was considered a safety vehicle, not a performance vehicle. And the first Bricklins that came out were powered by an AMC engine, which was pretty powerful. Of course, AMC decided not to provide those engines anymore, and the later Bricklins went to Ford V8s, 351 cubic inch. 1973 to 76, the new bumper laws are in full force. Initially in 73, you got the rubber front bumper. By 1974, you got a rear bumper as well, and the little spoiler in the back or lip, it's gone. They had an add-on you could use later on, but hey, what can you do? Corvettes still had their T-tops and the coupes. 1978 to 82, these were the last years of the Stingray based on the Mako Shark. There was a special official pace car edition, silver and black, cool looking. GM adds a tacked on rear spoiler to those cars. Looks okay, but it looks tacked on. By 1982, the big glass, now remember the 68 to 70s had just a little flat window in the back and sail panels on the side. But Chevrolet decided to add a fastback styling again. But it was all glass, so you had a lot of cubic feet of window that would beat on the back of your head. But they added that. And the 25th anniversary Corvettes, beginning in 1978, had that new fastback design. It was glass, which is cool. You still have no trunk, but you got that fastback design. By 1982, though, that fastback design was improved, and the glass became an actual opening hatch. Cool looking. Be honest with you, I'd love to have one of those. The 78 to 82 Again, still rubber bumper car, lower horsepower. They had some commemorative models back in those days. It went 0 to 60 in 6.6 seconds, quarter mile at 15.3. Not earth-shattering by any stretch of the imagination. In 1978 to 82, again, those are the last years of the Corvette, it got stodgy, it got more luxury-based. You still got that same front suspension that it introduced in 1953. Oh, well. They improved it as time went by, and now the competition was getting stronger. DeLorean introduces his car. The 280 Nissan ZX Turbo was now hot on the tail of the Corvette. 911 Porsches, Ferrari 308, that's what they say was a competitor. I don't know. Chevy marks the 1982 as the third-generation Corvette's final year. The model is a far cry from what it was back in 1968, and the 82 Corvette sold strictly with a 200-horsepower 350. Now, they say it was mated to a 4-speed automatic. No manual transmissions. Sad day. But things were about to change. Now, in 1983, there were no Corvettes. No new Corvettes produced in 1983 for public consumption. There were about 50 1983 Corvettes produced for evaluation purposes, testing, and so forth. The difference between a 1983 pre-production vehicle or test vehicle and a 1984, not real significant. Biggest thing that I could see was wheels and tire size. And I've seen the 1983 back at the museum in Bowling Green, Kentucky. I think there's only one left. The others all got crushed. But 1984 ushered in the C4, or fourth generation Corvette. Total radical change for the Corvette. This is a completely different car. The only thing carried over from the 1982 model was the Crossfire fuel-injected engine. It only lasted for 1 year. It was low on horsepower, and the enthusiasts were clamoring for more horsepower again. However, the 1984 Corvette was such a good handling and driving car that in A stock, running road racing, the competitors who couldn't keep up with it were complaining the Corvette was really a race car. SCCA, the Sports Car Club of America, decided, well, we'll appease some of these guys and we'll start a special class for these cars called the Corvette Challenge. And out of that birthed a whole new era of C4 Corvettes. Hand-built engines, special wheels. These cars were amazing. The handling of these cars was great. And I had a friend who worked for one of the magazines at the time, and he was the photographer. Got to shoot the new car. The 1984 Car of the Year was the Corvette. And, well, I guess we can tell people now, he let me drive it. Oh, this thing was amazing. 1983, to see this radical styling of a car and driving it, it was an amazing car. I knew it was on my bucket list, and a few years later, I was able to get my first Corvette. It was a 1985, first year of the Crossfire injection. Now, I didn't go with the manual transmission. That was a Doug Nash-inspired 4+3. It was an automatic overdrive. You automatically went into overdrive whether you wanted to or not in second, third, and fourth gear. It gave you a lot of, well, different gear ratios. And the fuel mileage wasn't all that bad, but it was an unreliable transmission at best. And it was very cumbersome because it just shifted whether you wanted it to or not in second, third, and fourth gear into an overdrive. I had a vehicle, or I drove the vehicle that had the 50 or the 49 state cutout switch, so you could eliminate that. That made a big difference. You could run through all four gears, then hit the switch and put it in overdrive at that point in time. 25 miles per gallon was not unheard of. Now, I got the 85 model. I didn't get the stick. I got the 700R transmission, and man, other than being an automatic transmission, I really liked the car. And that was my first Corvette. I've had another C4, but I waited until the Getrag, or the ZF, 5 or 6-speed was available beginning in 1989. Now, this is just on the cusp of them introducing the twin cam V8. I got the 350. Two-port injection became the standard in 1985. They got rid of the twin throttle body, so the Crossfire injection system, going to the port-injected, tuned port V8 engine. Had a lot more horsepower, 230 to start with. Mine was 245, and that was good. That was great. 25 miles per gallon, good cruising down the highway. Loved the car. It had to go away a few years ago, and we replaced it with a C5, a completely different vehicle. So the new Corvette, 0 to 60 in 6.7 seconds, quarter mile 15.1. I ran 14.95 at altitude at LA County Raceway. I took my car down the track, the automatic, not the manual transmission version. And I was quite happy with that. It did quite well. We ran 8th mile, and I ran 9.65 in the 8th, I think it was. So I was happy with that. That was a good performance car for me, plus the great gas mileage, 25 miles per gallon for a V8 performance car. That was great. Well, the C4 stayed in production through 1980 or 92, and it was 1992. They rounded off the car. They made it look a little bit better. It still had pop-up headlights. It was a comfortable car, a little difficult to get into because the body kind of came down below the frame rails and they wrapped around the driver and the passenger. So you had to climb over those to get into the car. Still a fun car. I loved it. I'm even targeting getting another one, but we'll see about that. But the last of that C4 model, 300 horsepower, 330 foot-pounds of torque. Oh, what a car. Like to get another one. 96 was the grandest Corvette of the times. And that was, well, I guess the C4 stayed in production for a while after that, or into that point. The LT4 engine was now a better injection system, and the Grand Sport was introduced. Blue with the white stripe, the hash marks on the front fender, a little bit wider flares on the rear to cover the bigger tires. Now, this is not the LT5, which had the twin cam motor. This was a very nice car. Not more trackable. It was just fine. But it was a great car. You could get it any color you wanted as long as it was Admiral Blue. But you got to remember, Chevrolet is now making special edition Corvettes. So every once in a while there was a special edition, and the Grand Sport was one of them. In 1997, things changed drastically. A brand new Corvette, the C5 was what they call them. 1997, rounder body style, more horsepower, better chassis design, better suspension. It was an improvement over the C4, but the C4 was an improvement over the C3. Corvette people tend to malign the C4, saying it's not as good as the C5. Well, of course not. But the C3 is not as good as the C4 either. And a C2 is not as good as the C3. So get over it, guys. As things change, things get better. And I've had two C5s, like them. They're good. LT4 and LT1 engines, LS1 displacing 5.7 liters, 345 horsepower. Now, both of the C5s we've had are automatics, which really doesn't please my wife or myself. We'd rather have the manual transmissions. But we got to find that. C5 stayed in production for quite some time. There was a Z06 version with a notchback roof. That's my favorite of the C5s. And if I don't get another C4, that's the C5 I'm going to be looking for. The Z06 came out, like I said, with this notchback roof, lots more horsepower, better suspension, wider tires and wheels. It was good. 385 horsepower, 3,100 pounds, great acceleration. And taking our C5 on this a trip we took, we went from California to Prescott, Arizona. We averaged between 25 and 28 miles per gallon on the highway. Not going to tell you how fast we ran. We'll leave it at that. Now, the Z06, 405 horsepower, 4.3 seconds to 60. What a difference. The C6 comes out in 2005. Now, the chassis stays the same pretty much as the C5, but the body is totally revamped, and for the first time since 1962, there's fixed headlights. No more pop-up headlights. The C6 is a radical change body-wise. It's a good-looking car. It has some purists upset because of the lack of flip-up headlights. But the reality is the fixed headlights were much better for fuel economy and less expensive to produce. Trust me. 6th generation has some changes. The car keeps progressing and getting better. Goes up to 6 liters now, known as the LS2 engine, pushing 400 horsepower. Transmissions now in the back, beginning with the C5. I didn't mention that, but transaxle. They put the transmission in the back. It's a transaxle, giving the vehicle almost a 50-50 weight distribution now, making the C5 and C6 some of the best handling Corvettes ever. The Z06 in 2006, well, that created a lot of changes. Wider body, wider wheels, wider tires, 7 liters versus V8, 505 horsepower, 0-60 in 3.4 seconds. While the Chevrolet beats the Viper SRT10, in comparison tests, it fails to topple the 911 Porsche and the Ferrari. Who cares? If you're looking at a Ferrari, you're not considering a Corvette. But those are the cars the magazines compare things to. In 2009, the ZR1 returns. Now, the ZR1 is now the highest performance Corvette, and it is a monster. 6.2 liter V8, 638 horsepower, and a top speed 205 miles an hour. Just the thing you need on your local highway. Now, it is shutting down the Ferraris and everything else in its wake. In 2010, the Grand Sport version of this C6 comes out, and it is a dynamite car. Now, it hasn't got the horsepower of the Z06 or the ZR1, but it's got the body style. It's got the wheels and the tires. It's got the handling. It was a cool car. It saved you some money. And it's now compared to the Shelby Mustang GT500, which it beats. Well, of course it does. You've got a steel car versus a glass car. Cubic inches are good, and a special edition comes out. It's the Corvette 427, 505 horsepower. Still an LS Series small block, but big inside. 7th generation Corvette, beginning in 2014. Another total redesign of the Corvette. Still got the transaxle in the back. Body style completely different. Interior completely different. I went to the press introduction of that car, and I was amazed. It was beautiful. It was pricey. Now they're getting into the price zones that I'm way out of, but it's there. Then they come out with the king of the hill, the Z06. 6.2 liter, 650 horsepower. 0-60 in 3 seconds. Man, this thing is great. 300-foot skid pad, 1.9 Gs. This is a race car on the street. In 2017, well, they say it returns to innocent. The wide-body Grand Sport returns in 2017, and it is a hit. 2019, they got some big wings on these things, and the horsepower is in full bloom. Only rated at 20 miles per gallon at that point, but a 7-speed manual is standard on the ZR1 for 2019. It makes 755 horsepower. In 2020, Argus Duntop's desires, well, they're there. Chevrolet finally goes to a mid-engine design. A totally radical vehicle, beautiful car, excellent handling, excellent driving car. The manual transmission's gone. You cannot get one. And the 7th generation is replaced by a mid-engine car that is just a world beater. Price-wise, you can't touch it in comparison to a Ferrari or even the Porsches. It will blow the doors off of those cars for half the price or less. Corvette, 70 years of progress. Wrap your ass in fiberglass and drive a Corvette. I'm Hot Rod Bob. You've got gas, the Great American Auto Scene. Check it out on Facebook. Check it out on YouTube. Become a subscriber. It's free. Like, share, subscribe. I'd appreciate it. Thank you for joining me on GAAS, the Great American Auto Scene. Well, you know, it's race night. I got to head out to Irwindale Drag Strip. We're drag racing tonight. Come on out and say hi if you can. Take care. Thanks for being a gasaholic. You have a great day. I'm Hot Rod Bob, and you've got gas.